As political upheaval presents itself in Hong Kong, a movement that started out against a controversial law has expanded into something much bigger. Last summer, Hong Kongers pronounced their dissent against a newly passed bill that would have allowed for case-by-case extraditions in China. The passing of this bill meant that mainland China would be violating the Hong Kong Basic Law, which allowed Hong Kong to govern itself and for citizens to receive rights they would have in China. Many Hong Kongers viewed this as an endangerment to their rights, and worried that in the future they would completely lose their freedom. This has erupted into an extensive argument of what it meant to be from Hong Kong, and protests followed it. A question arising from this affair is, what are China's attitudes toward the protesters, as well as how did the protesters feel being a part of the protest in relation to Hong Kong identity? To dig deeper into the roots of Hong Kong's identity, we have to look back at its history. Hong Kong belongs to China, but it recognizes its own currency, political system, and even cultural identity. The division can be traced back to the 1800s when the Qing government lost the Opium Wars and Hong Kong became a colony of Great Britain for more than 150 years. It wasn't until 1997 that Hong Kong was returned back to China, yet still kept its own governing system, resulting in a policy called One Country, Two Systems. Upon returning back to China, Hong Kong was granted the right to develop its own democracy, but recently Beijing has been saying it has complete jurisdiction over Hong Kong. In response, Hong Kongers flooded the streets of peaceful protests, strikes on multiple industries, and vandalism. However, as the situation worsened, there have been small group violent outbreaks which faced major scrutiny from mainland China.
Many Chinese news writers scrutinize Hong Kongers' actions as acts of betrayal. These Chinese news writers claim that Hong Kong never had democratic freedom under British rule, and Hong Kongers are parasites of mainland China, using their water, food, and etc. This displays the Chinese attitude toward violent protesters, as they view them as xiaoren for turning against China, and they end up in the conflicting position of viewing protesters as parasites and therefore inherently an outsider, while the rest of Hong Kong was still recognized as China. From Hong Kongers' perspective, they did not feel a sense of belonging to China. It was not until recent years that it had returned to China, and it was under British control for many generations. The population consisted of many who lived under British rule where they had a sense of democracy and freedom. The sudden feeling of being controlled by another government felt like a threat. Furthermore, when Hong Kong returned to China, the influx of mainland Chinese residents and traders who used Hong Kong to conduct illegal commercial transactions deepened their disliking towards mainland China. This feeling of Hong Kong identity could be compared with the Han-Xiongnu relationship in Chinese history. Xiongnu was a nomadic people in northern China in ancient times who claimed themselves as an independent group. However, according to Shi Ji written by Sima Qian, the ancestors of Xiongnu were adherents of the ancient Xia dynasty and share a similar ancestry as the Han people. Just like the Hong Kongers, the Xiongnu people, due to their long-time isolation from the central states, developed a distinct system of rituals and cultural practices. For example, they ride horses and wear clothes of hide and fur. They do not construct graves, nor wear mourning garments for funerals. Therefore, when considering their own identity, they don't follow their Chinese identity in modern political standards, but rather assume a Xiongnu identity that better characterizes the unique culture they have celebrated. In both Xiongnu and Hong Kong, the self-identity arises from the emergence of a unique culture due to physical isolation from their people of ancestry. Before 1997, for example, most Hong Kong schools adopted English textbooks, except when teaching Mandarin. The music and film productions of Hong Kong were also distinct from those of mainland China, and best representative of the Hong Kong territory. Thus, for Hong Kongers, the basis of Hong Kong identity arises from the empire of value concept, where they are unable to consider themselves Chinese due to their cultural differences. On the other hand, however, the Hong Kong identity is not shared among all inhabitants of Hong Kong. For many of these nationalists, they believe that Hong Kong belongs to the Chinese identity due to the notion of one China. Their reasoning is based upon the concept of a bounded region, which applies Chineseness to all territories within the Chinese border. Thus, the eruption of conflicts in Hong Kong is more than simple protests, but also underlying clashes between different perceptions of Chineseness. In a sense, there was a multitude of feelings protesters felt in relation to the Hong Kong identity. First, they believed that Hong Kong identity referred to a sense of collective resilience and autonomy, which was shown by protesting against government oppression. In this case, the identity seemed to be independent and would not fit with the overarching identity of China. Second, protesters were proud of Hong Kong for its community spirit. They thought that the protest had strengthened their position different from the mainland. Lastly, the occurrence of the extradition bill made them feel the need to stand up against it, which tightened the sense of unity in Hong Kong. Together, these feelings strengthened the Hong Kong identity, separating mainland China and Hong Kong even further. Therefore, as protests continue in current Hong Kong, it begs the question of how this identity may shift during future confrontations. Would more people agree on the distinct cultures of Hong Kong society, or would the Hong Kong identity eventually weaken due to the interactions with mainland China in recent decades? The emerging Hong Kong identity is still open to new changes and questions.